So I thought maybe perhaps a good way forward is to just kind of give you a little bit of a sense of my own background and my own work. And then maybe we could then sort of like launch into talking about design and more specifically talking about image making, which is sort of like the primary focus of today's discussion anyway. So I'm just going to time myself here so I'm sort of like on cue. Just basically, I do currently in the last few years, several years, I've been really focused a lot on kind of put my design sort of like on the back of the stove a little bit, and really have been focusing a lot on scholarship, and in particular on writing. And my interest is graphic design history, or I should say, maybe I can kind of back up history itself, but more specifically, graphic design history. As you can see in some of these examples, this is a project that I was involved with just a few years back. This is a small little kind of pocketbook production by the Phaidon there in London. And there's sort of like a very kind of standard, typical publication that you see in, in sort of like circles and publishing circles, that is sort of like the hits, the top 500 hits of graphic design. What the sort of like the publishing industry in graphic design sort of like considers to be sort of like the hits, the sort of like, and that's not always a good thing, I think, in some ways, because it's sort of like, it's very much reflects the canon. And, I think our job today, especially, is to maybe think about like what's operating not only inside the canon, but also outside the canon of history. That's just something to sort of like think about. These are just a few spreads from inside the book. There's a nice little production putting this together. And I worked on a kind of a large scale Phaidon archive of graphic design, as is pictured here. This is kind of an interesting project where it's sort of like a card, the old kind of school card catalog that you would see in the library, and you kind of open the box up. It's actually a very large box. This image is not to scale. And then you pull out these sort of like individual sheets, if you will, which shows both Western and Eastern examples of graphic design. It's kind of an interesting idea, I think, in many ways. And then just some other various projects, writing projects. This particular writing project was a sort of like a review on 100 years of Swiss graphic design. And so my educational background is very much within the Swiss modernist tradition. That's sort of like how I came to learn and understand graphic design, is through that sort of like lens, if you will. So writing about Swiss graphic design for me was a real treat, because it's something that I really kind of connect to on a very kind of fundamental level. And it's what I was taught in graduate school in particular, was the basic elements and principles of Swiss graphic design from a very specifically modernist kind of perspective. So that was kind of interesting. Also, I've been involved in a lot of kind of international activities, This is actually an interesting project that I was involved with in 2008 to write about a Japanese designer. His name is Hideki Nakajima. And he does really interesting work with typography and image making. And so on a return from Tokyo, he had asked me if I could write a sort of like a portion of his new sort of like forthcoming book, which you see pictured here. So there was a very kind of an interesting experience I had with that. I've also been involved initially in my research with Jan Tschichold, who is quite a famous German graphic designer. This was a kind of a large scale project about his body of work, his lifetime of work. And so these are two different kinds of editions of the book that you see pictured here. This was an interior spread for the book. Really beautiful poster here that he produced a series of posters for Phobos Palace, which was so almost like a silent film movie house in Munich, Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. It's really quite interesting, but his posters are really beautiful. And then other types of projects, 17th to 20th century graphic design work, specifically ornamentation and typography. I've been involved with many editions of Meg's History of Graphic Design. Some of you might be familiar with this textbook. It's a sort of like the kind of catch-all educational textbook in North America. I've written some aspects of this project of Mexican graphic design, Chinese graphic design, obviously, with my work with China. And these are just a few other kind of writing projects that I've been involved with that you see pictured here, just kind of various publications and so forth. So mostly Western oriented work. As your professor had mentioned, in 2017, I did a Fulbright in China, and I'm pictured here with the main designer who I worked very closely with when I was on my Fulbright, and did a number of workshops and so forth, all really interesting. These are some images from a workshop on corporate identity that I gave in Vietnam, of all places. So if you get a chance to go to Vietnam, it's a really special place. It's really an interesting, very dynamic place to go. Specifically, I was in Ho Chi Minh City, and so the old name for Ho Chi Minh City is Saigon. So just a little bit of history. A couple of my students in China Women's University, they came and visited me while I was on my Fulbright. And just recently, in the last few years, pre-pandemic, I gave a couple of workshops in China. Actually, this was the last time I was in China, which seems like a lifetime ago, but was only about 3 years ago. So I'm hoping to get back soon. I actually have a couple of fellowships that I'm just waiting for the sort of like the doors to reopen to China to sort of like get back there. As you know, China is very tight about the COVID situation. So it's hard to get in and to get out of the country. Of course, I actually do work with posters as well, and so that's been a bit of a kind of on hiatus recently, since I've been working on some other projects. But I do in fact show my posters in national and international shows. This is a regional show, and just kind of showing me with a couple of my works, as you see pictured here on the left and right. And then just a few other examples of my work here as well. I can go in, if we have a little bit of time, I can go a little bit more into the work and talk about it, but just to sort of like give you kind of a quick little preview of that, that you can kind of see here. So my work really kind of seeks to kind of draw on experimental image making, and to kind of communicate in some ways the most clear-sighted, in the most clear-sighted way. Really, it's a sort of like documenting my travels across time and space. And my work really aims to kind of almost is sort of like very spontaneous, kind of juxtaposition of form and color. And often my methodology is very kind of eclectic, and there's really no real kind of singular style that really dominates my work. And I believe my work, my interest in graphic design history is kind of filters or kind of permeates through my work. And as you can see, many of my works are international in reach, strong emphasis on the Middle East or South America or Asia in particular. And my work tends to kind of be more socially kind of oriented to the more humanist side of the political spectrum. So that's that. And I wanted to just some other recent publishing articles I've been working on. I wanted to just kind of quickly talk a little bit about my research, my current research. Maybe spend about 3 or 4 minutes talking about that, and then we can jump into today's discussion about image making and so forth. I may need to kind of quickly run to the bathroom, so I know that this wasn't scheduled, but I can do it really quickly and come back to the lecture. But my current research is focused on contemporary Chinese graphic design, and in sort of like the latter part of the 20th century. So in the sort of like the 4 decades after the Cultural Revolution in China, which is specifically from 1966 to 1977, 78, from 1978 to the present is really the sort of like the focus of my current research, where I'm documenting the development of graphic design, and more specifically focusing on these 6 graphic designers that you see pictured here, and sort of like the sort of like how they sort of like have sort of like kind of kind of the sort of like kind of have returned to their rich history as a sort of like wellspring for the sort of like their aesthetic kind of style, if you will, which is very much associated with modern commerce. And so the research is really sort of like can be thought of within the context of contemporary China. And so these designers really kind of, as I mentioned, kind of drew upon the rich kind of traditions, artistic traditions, as a sort of like way to kind of, create this very kind of unique, specific kind of aesthetic. And so my project really kind of argues that there is this very kind of identifiable, unique Chinese graphic style, which is very much kind of rooted in this very kind of collectivist symbols and motifs of ancient China. And so, while these designers were being sort of like transformed by very kind of contemporary forces, this aesthetic really kind of predominantly is very ancient and very archetypal in nature, such as that sort of like these very kind of graphic symbols and motifs can be found between contemporary practice and ancient art forms, in particular through graphic or calligraphic style of the Chinese written language in particular. And then it's of course sort of like overlaid with these very kind of acquired graphic styles and very kind of contemporary influences. So that's sort of like my sort of like my research, if you will, to this. So why don't you all sort of like hold steady for 1 minute, and then I'll come back, and then I'll start talking about this idea of denotative and connotative image making. All right. Well, so the discussion, the thing here, I think that's really important to try to understand is the sort of like the power of image making is something that I think, whether you are, going into a field that an artistic field or graphic design, the fact that we as a culture today are very much like all video centric and the do-it-yourself sort of like DIY culture. I think it's really important for all of you to understand the importance to really look carefully at imagery. And so this talk really kind of looks at specifically what are images, and how do you make images, and how do we perceive images, right? So as it relates to graphic design, in the world of graphic design, oftentimes challenging problems often call for very unique imagery and image making, right? So the idea is to think about in the sort of like the active kind of sort of like making of imagery. I think it's really important to think about the notion of play, being playful, taking risks, and exploration and experimentation is really key. At the same time, I think it's really important to make work that allows you to really dive deeply into the making of whatever it is that you're making, specifically with image making. So the idea of being really resourceful, not depending on anybody but yourself in the making aspect of it. And the idea of being really sort of like endurance is really important. I sort of like learned the notion of endurance. The idea of endurance, I think, is sometimes overlooked when it comes to being artistic, because I think it's really important for one to be very industrious in their making. And the notion of endurance, I think, is really important. I learned endurance through marathon running and running ultra marathons. Like, so for example, running like at one time 50 miles, right? I know it sounds a little bit crazy, but the idea of training as an athlete, it like really helped me to kind of really be very focused in my artistic practice. I know it sounds a little odd, but I think you can make that sort of like connection. So we're looking at specifically denotative and connotative image making, right? It might be helpful for you to take some notes while I'm talking today as well, just to sort of like brainstorm a bit. And so when we think about imagery and the definitions of the image, we think very specifically about these two ideas. What is denotative and what is connotative? So we're going to kind of walk through and look very specifically at these two things. And what I'm going to use is I'm going to start with denotative, and I'm going to talk about what that means. And I'm going to use an apple, right, as an example. So denotative is what it means is the literal and the very kind of primary meaning of the word, right? So when I connect the notion of denotative to an apple, we know that it's very much an apple, right? Generally speaking, it sort of like indicates or refers to something by a word or by a symbol, right? So it signifies. And it's very direct and it's very specific. So anything that's perhaps photographic is denotative, right? So if somebody says landscape, then I would assume that the denotative image representation is going to be very specifically a landscape, right? Or in the case of an apple, right? We see it, it has texture, it has a stem, it has perhaps a little leaf or something, right? And so the apple can also, we know that an apple has variety. So this looks like a Macintosh apple. I know you can probably get them where you are. I know in the South, you can't get a Macintosh apple. I've searched everywhere. You kind of have to go to the northern part of the United States to, I find that to be very funny because I was just in Vermont recently where I have a home. And of course, like Macintosh apples are, you can get Macintosh apples, you can get apple cider in Vermont. You can't get those things in the deep South. They're hard to come by. So again, here is another denotative image of an apple, right? It changes a little bit because this apple's green. It's a Granny Smith, but it's still an apple, right? It still has a stem. It still has a leaf. It's still very recognizable. So it's very, again, direct, and it's very specific. So we know that it's denotative, right? This is an apple that, when you cut into an apple, it ages very quickly, right? It almost starts to deform or change very rapidly because the air hits it. And so it's sort of like, it can become very unrecognizable very quickly. And so the effects of time on the apple happen really quickly. And this sort of like happens to everything, including the human body, right? When we die, right? It's just sort of like starts to break down, right? And that's just sort of like part of the sort of like the natural process of things, right? But then again, we can still recognize it as an apple, right? We can recognize it as an apple because I had shown you this apple and I had shown you this apple, right? So you have something within the context of our discussion today that helps you to make the leap from it being an apple that you would pick up in the store, and then maybe something that you would see that falls off of a tree onto the ground, and then therefore, here we are. This is what we see. So the apple is very denotative in these images that you see here, but then they are represented also by different varieties but they still don't lose their fundamental denotative quality, right? So, and also apples, as I had mentioned, can come in, can be made or transformed into other things as well, like apple cider. So it can change from something that's solid to something that's liquid, or something that is like applesauce, has texture, right? Or can be transformed into a pie, right? So I think it's really important to kind of think of, so it sort of like, because the apple is within this image, you know, it's still somewhat sort of like denotative. But apples also too have a very kind of symbolic kind of quality to them as well, that invoke certain kind of experiences. So for example, you know, bobbing for apples. So I don't know if all of you have ever done that before, but it's a sort of like something that kind of harkens back to childhood, and sort of like, so sort of like the games that we play in our childhood, more specifically as it's sort of like connected to the apple here. The apple also has symbolic, it resonates symbolically as well. So the apple, of course, is connected to the notion of education, right? And so, but the notion of an apple can also find its way onto different substrates other than photographs, like a tattoo, for example, or it can be changed in its shape as well. So, for example, we have something that can be transformed into something else. I like the idea of scale as well. We kind of think of an apple as being smaller than us, but what if it's larger than us? How does that challenge our way of thinking about these objects that we're used to seeing, that we can hold in our hand, but they can be transformed into something a lot differently, whether we sort of like break into it and sort of like cut it up. This is an example of a poster by a German designer. His name is Günter Rambau. And he sort of like takes very ordinary things and he transforms them so that we can think about them as being sort of like extraordinary, right? So he'll take two things and sort of like put them together to kind of create something new, right? As is in this poster. Or this potato, where he creates a potato within a potato, right? And that sort of like changes the way that we think about these things. Or like a head of cauliflower. He cuts away from the way that we think about it in a very denotative way and creates something that's kind of new, but still has these qualities of the cauliflower, right? So kind of thinking about the denotative, we move now into sort of like the connotative, which is more of sort of like an idea or feeling that kind of invokes the word. So if you remember, I had shown the three apples, the Macintosh, the Granny Smith, and, you know, and then a yellow variety. So then now we can sort of like make the leap to something that implies the idea of an apple, but doesn't literally show the apple. And that's when things start to get really more interesting. And that's where I begin to sort of like define the connotative. We're moving from something that's literal to something that is more suggestive of the image of an apple, right? And so here, maybe more denotative, but also symbolically, as it is pictured here, Snow White and the apple, or William Tell, right? William Tell is a famous Swiss folk legend of an archer who with a crossbow, and he's so precise that he can shoot the arrow through the apple that's on top of the boy's head, right? So, and as you can see in these sort of like examples here, I wanted to show, I just sort of like introduced these two examples. This is a very famous, extraordinarily famous Swiss poster by Armin Hoffman. And it shows the typography TELL piercing into the apple, right? But the typography becomes sort of like an arrowhead that moves into this. And then the same thing here. This is a poster of the place where William Tell, the legend, began in Switzerland. This is a town called Ennetbergen in Switzerland, and shows the work of Melchior Imboden, who was a Swiss graphic designer. But getting back to this apple, we have the sort of like more abstract sort of like representation or emotion or imply the notion of an apple. Most of you can recognize the Japanese flag here. This is the modern crest of Japan, but you can sort of like make the connection to the apple. Here's a picture of Adam and Eve. And then of course, we have I Love New York logo by Milton Glaser, the American graphic designer. Again, the Big Apple, okay, sort of like implies the idea, in sort of like the idea of education. The apple is connected to the branding for Apple Computer. And then of course the Big Apple, right? So I don't need to show an apple, but just make to sort of like imply, to make a connection to the idea of the Big Apple to Lower Manhattan, as is seen here in this image, or the Beatles in Abbey Road, crossing this kind of the famous Abbey Road is the Apple records, right? Is the sort of like the production for the music for the Beatles was Apple Records. So you can make a sort of like a connection to the Beatles and the apple, or perhaps the planet Mars, or, so you can begin to sort of like make these sort of like kind of imply the idea of an apple to these ideas. Another form of image making is stylization, how you treat or depict this apple in a perhaps non-realistic way. So the object kind of remains recognizable, but you stylize it in a way that creates an interesting non-realistic depiction of the apple, as you can see here in some of these examples. And so whether you use different various media and mediums to create that representation of the apple, as is done in some of these examples that you see here. This is a wonderful sort of like depiction, a painting by the French painter, or Cézanne, Paul Cézanne, or Matisse, or Picasso, for example, how they represent a piece of fruit or an apple. And this can be done in many different ways. This is the work of Yayoi Kusama. She's a contemporary artist whose work is primarily, or French way of thinking about the apple in a very kind of surrealistic sort of like way. And then also too, thinking about the apple in terms of abstraction. So we have the London Underground logo, but you can make a connection to the shape of the apple through even the London Underground. Or if you take it a little bit further, the idea of abstraction is kind of taking it a little bit more deeply into that sort of like dealing with the idea of an apple or the representation or essence of the apple, but the object is no longer necessarily recognizable, right? We can't see the apple, but we can perhaps make some connection to its color, right? Through the color red. This is the work of Mark Rothko, for example, a painting by Mark Rothko. And so we can see sort of, and sometimes images, there's an overlaying of denotative, connotative, stylization, and abstract. They layer each other, right? It's not always just denotative or connotative, but it can be denotative, connotative, stylized, and abstracted together, right? And that's when images become really interesting and really powerful. And as I said, the contemporary artist Yo-Yo Kusama really kind of takes her work in a very kind of conceptual way. And she really deals with minimalism, feminism, surrealism, pop art, abstract expressionism, and moves her work into this very kind of explicit sort of like abstraction. And I tried to find work that might connect in some way to sort of like the abstraction of her work as it relates to this idea that we're thinking about today, this idea of sort of like abstraction.